Welcome back. I have another story this week that goes with traditions. This one is a tradition that actually started way back in England and Scotland a long time ago. People would take the scraps from their old clothes and they would make them into a quilt instead of wasting the fabric or just throwing the clothes away. Back then they didn't have a lot of stores like Goodwill or Kiwanis that you could take your clothes to get rid of so someone else could get them if they wanted. So instead of wasting the fabric and making more dirt and garbage in the landfill, people would cut up pieces of their clothing and make quilts for their beds. A lot of times people would also make them like the tradition in my family where you use yarn and make a baby blanket. They also sometimes use those scraps of fabric for a quilt. So for example, a baby might get a quilt that had part of grandma's clothes on it and part of mom's clothes on it, maybe part of big brother or big sister's clothes on it, and maybe dad's clothes. So let's read a story that talks about how making a quilt can be part of a family tradition. This story is realistic fiction and it's by Sarah Hughes and it's illustrated by Jill Dubin. And while we read it, I want you to think about how is this story the same or different from the other stories that we've read about traditions? What's something that you notice that's the same about all of the traditions in the story? Leah, come see the family quilt, says Mom. Your great grandma started it long ago. It's from before I was born, says Leah. That's right, says Mom. Times were difficult back then. Nobody had a job. I heard that great grandma made this quilt with cloth scraps. The front of each square tells a story, says Grandma. This was our first TV. It looks funny, Leah says. What should we put on our family square? Asks Mom. How about a picture of us planting our spruce tree? Says Leah. Great idea, says Dad. This makes me think of my family. My family did a quilt for my grandmother when she moved out of her house and she started going from place to place in a trailer for visiting all of her family. She wanted to have something that she could remember everybody by. So instead of having a whole trailer full of furniture or things that take up a lot of space, we made one big quilt and each family member made a square. I loved animals, so I made a quilt square that had animals on it. My family was the only part of our family that lived in Tennessee. So my mom made a quilt block with the state of Tennessee on it. My cousin loved monkeys and apes, so she put a gorilla on her square. That way, when my grandmother looked at each square, all she had to do was look at the picture and she could think of the family that gave her that part of the quilt. It sounds like this family has done a lot of that same thing. Let's use this picture, says Leah. I'll have to shrink it to fit, says Mom. I'll find some cloth for our square tomorrow, says Mom. It's getting late. Aw, says Leah. Have you ever done a project with your family that you didn't want to quit because it was so much fun? The next morning, Leah can't wait to begin. I'll thread the needle and sew the square, says Grandma. May I help? Asks Leah. Of course, Grandma says. Leah, can you push the stuffing inside the square? Grandma asks. Yes, says Leah. Now I'll sew it closed, explains Grandma. We'll keep the quilt for a year, says Mom. Next, It goes to your cousins, says Dad. I wish we could make a quilt every day, says Leah. Sometimes traditions are so much fun that we want to do them a lot. But if we do a tradition too much, it loses that specialness. So the next story talks about how to make a quilt square. It's a how-to. So it has step-by-step directions. I'm going to go ahead and read it in case you decide maybe you want to try making a family quilt square. People make quilts for lots of reasons. Quilts can show a part of history. They can also keep us warm. People make quilts for fun. No matter the reason, all quilts begin with a square. First, it says, cut 2 squares of cloth the same size. Sew 3 sides of the squares together, inside and out, and have an adult help you. Turn the cloth right side out. Fill the square with stuffing, and sew the 4th side closed. There are new kinds of quilts now because people get so many t-shirts, they don't know what to do with them all. And again, we don't want to keep throwing stuff in the landfill. So if the idea of sewing a quilt square together the way that they showed on there doesn't really appeal, you might be able to make one that's kind of tied together. And the ideas for that you can do a Google search for and just look up t-shirt quilts, and you can find lots and lots of ideas on how to make that happen. That might be a fun summer project. Now you got me thinking. I have all these ideas I want to do for summer. I hope you enjoy the story, and maybe you'll get adventurous and try and make your own family's quilt square.